Our third category of biologically relevant macromolecules are the proteins. Now, proteins make up a huge proportion of the cell. So if we were to dry out the cell, take out the water, more than 50% of what's left will actually be protein. Now, typically when we think of proteins, we might think of enzymes. And it's true, one of the most important functions of proteins within the cell is to speed up chemical reactions or to be catalysts, right? Enzymes are going to be proteins that act as catalysts and can speed up whatever chemical reaction they were meant to speed up. The nice thing about enzymes is that they're never used up by a chemical reaction. So they can be used repeatedly, and they are essentially the workhorses that carry out all the processes of life for the most part. Now, when we look at proteins, though, having enzymatic function is definitely not the only function that proteins have. And in fact, they have a completely diverse slew of functions, and we're going to actually focus on 8 of them. So I've got 4 on this slide. I'm going to talk about 4 on the next slide. So in the first box, right, we have our enzymatic proteins. We talked already about this. So here we have a nice little purple enzyme. Remember, in the slides, in your textbook, anything that's purple usually indicates it's a protein. So as we look through each of these images, anything you see that's purple, that means protein. All right, so here's our little enzyme. This looks like a disaccharide. It looks like this particular enzyme is participating in the chemical reaction that is going to break this disaccharide into 2 individual monosaccharides. Again, it speeds up that chemical reaction. And if you recall from earlier in chapter 5, when we talked about what kinds of chemical reactions make and break polymers, well, in this case, we would be using a hydrolysis reaction to break that double bond, or to break that covalent bond between that double sugar, that disaccharide. Okay, so proteins can be enzymes. Number 2, in the upper right-hand corner, proteins can also be defensive proteins. They can participate as part of your immune system. So, right, during cold and flu season, we might oftentimes think about our immune system, and there are a variety of different proteins that play important roles within the immune system, but one of them in particular being your antibodies. So if you take a look at this image here, all of these little Y-shaped structures are antibodies, and they're protein components that have the ability to recognize invading particles, maybe a virus, maybe part of a bacterial protein. And what they do is when an antibody detects a particular invading particle, it attaches to it, much like you see here on the surface of the bacteria or the virus. It attaches to it and acts like a flag. It says, hey, I found something over here that's not supposed to be here. It's going to make us sick. We need to destroy it. And essentially elicits other cells of the immune system to come over and destroy whatever molecule or invading particle that antibody has tagged. All right, so number 2, defensive proteins. Number 3, some proteins have a storage role. So we haven't discussed this yet, at least not in detail, but proteins are made out of amino acids. So if you want to build a protein, you need to have available amino acids as the monomers to build whatever protein you want to build. So if you imagine an egg, right? And inside of that egg, you have an embryo, and that embryo is going to grow into a chick. And in order to grow into a chick, you need to build things like lipids and proteins, and you need some carbohydrates in there, you need some nucleic acids. So everything that you need to build that chick has got to be inside of that shell, because that embryo has no connection to the outside world. It can't get nutrients from the outside world. It has to use whatever's in there. So as the chick is developing and it needs to build those proteins, it needs a decent supply of amino acids. So some proteins, their only function is to store amino acids so that, for example, the embryo can build whatever proteins it needs to build. Now, one of the more common storage proteins, especially when we're taking eggs into consideration, is ovalbumin. So it essentially sits there inside the egg until enzymes degrade it into individual amino acids, and then those amino acids are used by the embryo to build whatever proteins it needs to build to develop into a chick. Okay, function number 4. We have transport proteins. We're going to talk quite a bit about these when we get to chapter 7 and we discuss membrane function and membrane transport. So when we looked, albeit very briefly, at that phospholipid bilayer, which you can see here in the background, that makes membranes for cells, you have that hydrophobic core where all those fatty acid tails are. And that's a hydrophobic core where hydrophilic molecules don't want to be. And hydrophilic molecules have a hard time passing through that membrane. They can't get into the cell, they can't get out of the cell. So one of the ways to help with the passage of these hydrophilic molecules across the membrane, cells will take and they will create transport proteins. And the proteins here will span all the way across the membrane from one side to the other, and they will help to shuttle across various components that would otherwise have a very difficult time getting across the hydrophobic core of that cell membrane. Okay, our 5th protein function. So some proteins function as signaling molecules, or what we call hormones. We've talked about insulin multiple times throughout the semester already. Insulin is a great example of a protein-based hormone. Now, not all hormones are proteins, right? We talked about other hormones like estradiol and testosterone, also signaling molecules, also hormones, but those are steroid or lipid-based. But again, insulin, this is a different kind of hormone or signaling molecule, and this one happens to be protein-based. Hormones, their main function is to transmit a signal, transmit a message from one cell to another cell. In the case of insulin, it's produced by the pancreas in response to high blood glucose, but it tells completely different cells what to do, right? It tells the liver and the muscle cells to take up that extra blood glucose and store it as glycogen for later. Okay, the way that cells have the ability to respond to signaling molecules like hormones is by producing receptor proteins on the outside of the cell. So maybe let's draw this and see what it looks like. Get rid of our little phospholipid here. So let's say I have a cell, right? And the cell is going to want to interact with a hormone. And let's say the hormone is this little guy right here. That's our hormone. Right, this little triangle there. And the hormone, typically hormones don't have the ability to pass across the membrane here of the cell. So what they need to do is they actually need to bind here to a receptor molecule. This guy right here, this is our receptor. And when that hormone binds to the receptor, it transmits a signal to the inside of the cell and tells the cell what to do. Maybe in this case, it will tell the cell to take up blood glucose, for example. Maybe it's a liver or muscle cell. So this hormone here can be a protein, but, I should have done this in purple, but the receptor molecule that receives the signal molecule can also be a protein as well. So you essentially need both of those, right? Both the receptor protein in conjunction with the signaling molecule to get the message across. Okay, what are we on? 7. Our 7th function of proteins down here, we have our contractile and our motor proteins. So these are going to participate in movement. This can be movement of material on the inside of a cell. It can be movement of the cell itself. It can be movement of tissues within organisms, for example. Typically, you're going to have some sort of motor protein that actually does the moving. Oftentimes that interacts with other components, much like your skeletal system and your muscular system work together to help you move, right? If you were just a blob of muscles, you probably wouldn't get too far. If you were just a skeleton, also, you wouldn't get very far. You need sort of the conjunction of the muscles and the skeleton to actually move someplace. Very similar. So In the case of our motor protein example down here, so this is taken from muscle tissue. So as we'll see later on as well, muscle tissue, sometimes if you have a striated muscle, if that's what you're looking at, you'll have sort of striped muscle tissue. And this striping comes from the way that fibers or proteins are organized within that muscle tissue. And so here in purple, we have these myosin fibers. And what the myosin fibers have are sort of these heads. And the heads will essentially grab a hold and they'll pull on those actin filaments that are in orange. And this allows then the muscle cell to contract. Or they can also let go of the actin and allow the muscle cell to expand. And this essentially is what makes your muscles contract and release and what helps you as a multicellular organism move around. And then our last function of proteins are going to be our structural proteins. So these are primarily there for support. Things like keratin. This is a protein that's found in your hair. It's found in skin as well to give it support. We will also talk about some of the support proteins that are found on the inside of the cell that give cells what is called their cytoskeleton. Much like you have a skeleton for structural support, cells have the same thing. That skeleton just happens to be made out of proteins instead of bones. So clearly you can see that proteins have a variety of different functions. They're very, very diverse. Now, what are proteins made out of now that we know what they participate in within the cell? So again, proteins are constructed as true polymers. So we need to talk about what do we call the monomer, what do we call the polymer, and what do we call that covalent bond that links the monomers together in this protein category. So first of all, our monomers for proteins, these are going to be the amino acids. There are about 20 amino acids that are useful for constructing proteins. And when we construct proteins, the first thing we really build is what is called a polypeptide. This is essentially the polymer of the protein. And the way that polypeptides are built is just by stringing along a whole bunch of amino acids one after another, kind of like beads on a necklace. This is going to be an unbranched chain, just a single line of these amino acids all linked to each other. Now, polypeptides are sometimes confused with proteins. These are actually two quite different components. So you can take the individual amino acids, link them together to form the polypeptide, but just having this long chain of amino acids does not make a protein. That polypeptide has to fold to take on its functional form in order to be called a protein, which is that biologically active or functional molecule. And sometimes proteins can even consist of multiple polypeptides. This is something we'll take a look at later as well. So let's first cover what is the actual structure of an amino acid, this monomer, this building block for proteins. So we've kind of had a preview for our amino acids when we were discussing the chemical groups back in chapter 4. But if we take a look, all amino acids are going to have the exact same basic structure down here. It all starts out with an alpha carbon in the middle, so this pink carbon. Attached to this carbon, remember carbon has a valence of 4, right? Every single amino acid has the same 3 components attached to the carbon, and where they differ is that 4th pair of electrons that they need to share. So if we look at the similar components of the amino acids attached to this carbon, one of them is always going to be a hydrogen. That's pretty simple. And then on the right and left hand sides, here we have the carboxyl group on one side and the amino group on the opposite side. So this portion right down here, every single amino acid has this, right? There's no variability here. Where they do vary and how we can have different kinds of amino acids is here in this side chain or the R group. Every amino acid now will have a different R group. So if we were to take a look at the 20 relevant amino acids here, you'll notice that they're sort of organized into groups and they're color-coded. All of that basic, similar structure for the amino acids is highlighted in purple for all of them, all 20. And then the different colored sections here in yellow, green, pink, and blue, these are going to be those R groups, places where those amino acids differ. So up here, you have your hydrophobic R groups. You'll notice they're primarily hydrocarbons. There's no oxygens here. Again, remember, anything that's hydrocarbon is going to be hydrophobic with nonpolar covalent bonds. Down here, you're going to have your hydrophilic amino acids, ones that have a lot of oxygens or nitrogens to sort of make sure that the electrons are not shared equally and you have that charge separation. Down here, you have your basic or your positively charged amino acids. Remember, with the amino group, they can act as